Welcome back to the channel. Today we're continuing with our journey with the Canon EOS-R, but today we're going to be looking at something more general, and we're going to be looking at the exposure triangle. And in this tutorial we're going to look at the fundamentals of exposure. So we're going to specifically introduce what is called the exposure triangle. Now, the exposure triangle is a basic concept in photography that shows the relationship between three primary settings controlling exposure. That is your aperture, or the opening of your lens, the shutter speed, how long your shutter is open when you're taking a picture or when you're doing video, and then the ISO, that means the sensitivity of your sensor to light. So these elements work together to determine the brightness or darkness of an image. Not only do they work together, but they also affect each other, so that when you adjust one, it's necessary for you to change at least one or the other elements, if not both, to maintain a proper exposure. And you can see this in action if you put your camera in auto mode and you just watch the aperture and the shutter speed and the ISO as you move in the scene, and you see how the camera automatically adjusts those three to get you what it thinks is the best exposure. So let's get straight to the first one, and that is your aperture. Now, aperture is the opening in a lens through which light enters the camera, and the aperture is expressed in f-stops. And so you'll see on your display the numbers like f2.8, f4 and f8 and so on. When you're reading f-stop numbers, a smaller f-stop number like 2.8 denotes a larger aperture, so a larger opening, than say f4 or f8. And this can be a little confusing, especially if you're a beginner photographer. And the reason the smaller number equals a larger aperture, it's like an inverse relationship, has to do with the math. And when we say f2.8, we're actually referring to a shortened form of a fraction. And what we actually mean is f1 over 2.8. So in reality, if you remember your math, as a number, f1 over 2.8 is actually larger as a number than f1 over 4. But then let's not let that confuse us. Just remember, when you see a smaller number, means a larger aperture, and you should be fine. So the primary effect of aperture is obviously how much light enters your lens. So a wider aperture or lower f-stop allows more light in, brightening the image, and a narrow aperture or a higher f-stop permits less light in, darkening the image. But aperture also has another effect on your image, and that is the creative effect. It affects what we call depth of field. Depth of field determines how much of your background and foreground in the image you are focused on will also be in focus. So wider apertures result in a shallow depth of field. And what that means is it blurs the background and foreground, whilst narrower apertures increase the depth of field, keeping more of your scene in focus. So whenever you want your subject to stand out from the background, you want to use wider apertures, so that your subject is in focus and the background is pushed out of focus. And that applies to the foreground as well. On the other hand, say you're shooting a group photo where people are standing in rows, and you want everyone in that group to be in focus, or you're shooting a landscape, you want to use a narrow aperture so that all the people in the rows from front to back are in focus. So, quick tip, lower f-stop equals more light, equals shallow depth of field, while the higher f-stop, less light and greater depth of field. So that's aperture. The second part of the exposure triangle is your shutter speed. Now, this is the duration the camera's shutter is open to expose the sensor to light. Shutter speed is measured in seconds or fractions of a second. So you'll see shutter speeds like 1 over 250 of a second, 1 over 60th, or even 1 second, 2 seconds, and so on. Just like aperture, the primary effect of shutter speed on your image is exposure, which is what we're looking at. And so the longer your aperture is open, the more light is allowed and the brighter your image is going to be, and vice versa. The shorter the speed, the less the light and the darker the image. But shutter speed also has a secondary creative effect, and that is it affects your motion blur. When you use longer exposures, you can blur moving subjects, and this can convey feeling of motion, whilst faster shutter speeds tend to freeze the action for sharp images. You can also use slower shutter speeds for low light scenes to allow more light where light is limited, but you might need a tripod to keep it steady. Otherwise your image will be blurry, because even a small amount of shake at long shutter speeds will result in smearing and blurring of the image. And so the quick tip to remember: the faster the shutter speed, the more frozen the action. The slower the shutter speed, the more motion blur you get in moving subjects. Finally, we look at ISO. It can simply be defined as the sensitivity of your camera's sensor. So when the light goes in, it hits the sensor, and ISO determines how sensitive that sensor is to light. Now, this is a definition that you'll find most people use, even though it's not quite accurate. It's a holdover from days when we used to use film camera, and the actual film used to be sensitive to light. The chemicals on the film itself were sensitive to light. So when referring to film cameras, that's a very accurate definition. ISO is represented by numbers like ISO 100, 400, 1600, and so on. Now the primary effect again is on exposure. So higher ISO values increase the sensor sensitivity, brightening your image, whilst lower ISO decreases the sensitivity, resulting in a darker image. Now the second and quite undesirable effect is that elevated ISO can introduce digital noise or grain, reducing the clarity of the image. So we generally aim at always using the lowest ISO possible whenever shooting to minimize digital noise. Like all other aspects of photography, this simple approach to ISO is not the full story, but you will learn more about ISO and why the lowest value may not always be the best as you get more advanced as a photographer and a filmmaker. Now, beyond this exposure triangle, there are other elements that are at the photographer's disposal to fine-tune exposure. You can use a setting called exposure compensation, and you can use something called flash compensation. Let's see how you can adjust the elements of the exposure triangle on this specific camera. You are only able to change these three elements, all of them, if you are in manual mode. If you are in auto mode, the camera basically decides all those for you, and if you are in the other modes, you have control of at least one, and then the camera adjusts the others for you. So if you want to control all three of them, then you need to be in manual mode. On this camera, to get into that manual mode, you simply press the mode button on top of the camera, and then when you see the menu, you hit the info button to select either photo mode or video mode, depending on what you want to do. Now you'll see, when you see that screen, you can now use the cross keys at the back of the camera to move between the different exposure modes that you have available to you. And you simply go to the M, that stands for the manual mode, and then hit set, and now you are in manual mode. In manual mode, the front dial, which we call the main dial by default, is set to change your shutter speed, and the rear one is set to change your aperture. To change your ISO, you need to press the multifunction button at the front here, and this brings up a menu that has several items that you can change. All you have to do now is select ISO, and then you can use your finger to adjust the ISO to where you want it to go, and you can also use the dials to do the same thing. You can also set your ISO to automatic. Now in automatic mode, you don't have control of the ISO anymore, and when the camera thinks that you need to boost your ISO, it will do that for you. Now I would not recommend this, because you need to always be in control of this particular parameter. Otherwise the camera might set a value that is too high and might introduce noise in your images. So whenever you can, keep it on manual and make sure you have complete control of your ISO. So Those are the ways you control your exposure on the Canon EOS-R and any camera for that matter, using the relationship of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, or most commonly known as the exposure triangle. Now in subsequent lessons, we're going to cover those in more detail individually, but understanding that you can use those for your exposure will help you as you start on your photography and videography journey. If you found value in this lesson, make sure to check out more of the content on this channel and hit that subscribe button, share, like, and make sure you hit that notification bell so that you're notified every time I upload more content. See you in the next lesson.